About a week ago, on the 2nd of August 2022, Speaker of the House, antediluvian vampire, and decrepit being from a time long lost, Nancy Pelosi has made a diplomatic trip to Taiwan with plans to meet with their president, Tsang Ing-wen. For security purposes, Pelosi was escorted to the small island nation accompanied by a number of U.S. warships directly into Taiwanese waters. And due to the fact that Taiwan is recognized by China as a part of China, the presence of the U.S. warships has been perceived as Pelosi leading a United States military incursion directly into Chinese territory. As a result, China's response has been to embargo food imports and sand exports to and from Taiwan, in addition to conducting a series of military drills around Taiwanese waters. However, as of my writing of this script, it would appear that Pelosi has left just as quickly as she arrived, and just like that, the diplomatic crisis is over. Those of you who have been paying attention to the current state of affairs in the world have probably noticed that tensions between the two powers has been steadily on the rise for some time now. Within the past few years, the US media and State Department has been periodically spinning the news and sensationalizing happenings within the PRC in an effort to demonize and convince the public to perceive China as a common enemy and threat. Every 6 months to a year or so, the flavor of propaganda and the narrative will change. One year, it's the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The next, it's the dystopic social credit score. The year after that, it's the protests in Hong Kong. And now, these past couple of times, it's been about Taiwanese sovereignty and independence. Quote, "Our congressional delegation visit to Taiwan honors America's unwavering commitment to support Taiwan's vibrant democracy. America's solidarity with the 23 million people of Taiwan is more important today than ever, as the world faces a choice between autocracy and democracy," unquote, said Pelosi upon arrival. This is the common justification given by politicians and media mouthpieces alike for everything that America does around the world. That Taiwan is just America's Make-A-Wish kid. They just want to make friends with and help the poor Taiwanese secure their national sovereignty against the evil communist Chinese aggression. Make no mistake, viewer. America's interests with Taiwan have nothing to do with preserving freedom and democracy. After all, America is the country which currently backs and supports over 70% of the world's dictatorships, routinely imposes and enables genocidal policies abroad, and since World War II has engaged in relentless regime change efforts across the world spanning dozens of countries located at and below the equator, be it undermining and overthrowing democratic governments via rigging elections, orchestrating coups d'etats, assassinations, color revolutions, sanctions, and so on. America has actually been the number one threat to freedom and democracy around the world. What they really mean by preserving freedom and democracy is the freedom of the United States ruling class and imperialists to basically go where they please, to exploit, pollute, rape and pillage as they please. So when you get down to the brass tacks, America doesn't have allies. It doesn't have rules, goals, or principles, or virtues of any kind. America only has interests. And so what are America's interests with Taiwan? Why does America care so much about this small island nation across the Pacific Ocean? To understand America's geopolitical motivations, one must first understand the historical context surrounding the issue. Back during the 1930s and 1940s, China was amidst a civil war with the United States-backed Kuomintang led by Chiang Kai-shek on one side, and the communist rebels and guerrillas led by the young Mao Zedong on the other. A few short years after the conclusion of World War II, the Communist Chinese decisively defeated the Kuomintang and established the People's Republic of China in 1949. Coinciding the establishment of the PRC, the remnants of the Kuomintang would flee to the province of Taiwan and establish their own separate governments known as the Republic of China. In the following decades, the Western world and the United States would continue to recognize Taiwan as the true sovereign government of China, effectively claiming all of mainland territory is rightfully theirs. In fact, all the way up until 1971, the United Nations recognized the Republic of China as the real representative government of the country. And all the way up until 1979, the United States recognized Taiwan as the real China as well. To this day, despite losing the Civil War and only occupying a small island province in the South China Sea, the Republic of China still considers itself the legitimate government of the entire territory constituting the mainland. I repeat, Taiwan considers itself the real China, even though the rest of the world no longer recognizes their claim. It's a very similar situation to what the US was trying to do with Venezuela recently. Anybody remember how a couple years ago, the US and Western media outlets were trying to push the fraudulent narrative that the current government of Venezuela is illegitimate, that it's actually a dictatorship that took power in fake elections, and that the CIA-backed comprador puppet Juan Guaido, the guy who was running around the country trying to orchestrate a coup of its democratically elected leadership, was the true sovereign leader of Venezuela? That is, promptly before Guaido and his fake government got chased out of the country by its citizenry. And this was all happening despite the fact that Guaido never even ran in the Venezuelan elections in the first place. His name and his party were never on the ballot. In other words, their legitimacy was propped up and inflated solely by the word of the United States government saying so. Venezuela had elections, the US governments didn't like the outcomes of said elections, and so immediately afterwards, they declare the elections fraudulent, slander Maduro a dictator, and sponsor a fake government which had plans to coup its way to power. Not only that, but the white middle-class opposition was little more than a violent fascist astroturf being propped up by the CIA to create the illusion of large popular support for Guaido and against Maduro. Even the opposition didn't really exist in meaningfully large numbers, however, since after a certain point, it was clear that both the people of Venezuela and the Venezuelan military were adamantly behind its leader, as Guaido's coup would fail spectacularly, and he, along with his fake government, would end up being chased out of the country. Years later, in the aftermath of said failed coup, what we are now left with is a fake government in exile which is still basically asserting itself to be the rightful government of Venezuela simply because America said that they were. The same could be said for Taiwan. The UN and the US really wanted the world to recognize the Republic of China as the real legitimate government of China, despite losing the Civil War and invading and occupying a small island province off of the coast of the South China Sea. But then once it became clear that the CPC was here to stay, and that they were willing to put a knife in the back of the Soviets and play ball with the West, the UN and US discarded their puppet satellite the moment it was politically convenient to do so. During the late 1970s, the West saw the heightening tensions between Sino-Soviet relations and moved into capitalizing on it, and so they flip-flopped their alliance, throwing their puppet Taiwan under the bus for a time and cozying up to the Chinese, driving a wedge between them and the Soviets further while at the same time setting China up to be opened up to the West and liberalized. It was a win-win situation. China got to experience a major economic boom, the Soviet Union would lose the Cold War, communism everywhere would be dismantled, and Western imperialists and the new Chinese bourgeoisie would get really fucking rich in the process. And so began America's policy of ambiguity. Despite Taiwan still recognizing itself as part of China and still declaring itself the real China, it no longer had the West's backing and blessing, taking a great deal of wind out of the sails of their claim. As I've stated before, and I'll say it again, America doesn't have allies, it only has interests. And now the US has turned a cold shoulder to China and is beginning to cozy back up to Taiwan yet again. Though the West no longer recognized Taiwan as China, China, on the other hand, still recognized Taiwan as China, as the PRC has undertaken efforts to integrate them into the mainland. At the end of the Cold War and in the years following, Taiwan would go from being a classic dictatorship under martial law to your standard Western liberal democracy, complete with presidential elections and so on. After it had become clear that Taiwan had no legal means to enforce its jurisdiction over the mainland, its presidents amended their constitution in the 90s, solidifying their status as an independent state. As of now, there is a split in Taiwanese politics between the Blue Pan Coalition, whom favor unification with the mainland, and the Green Pan Coalition, whom are Taiwanese nationalists in favor of independence. Ironic how the narrative and goalpost has shifted in recent decades. Despite the remnants of the Kuomintang being Chinese nationalists that emigrated and established themselves as the rightful government of China, despite still considering itself the rightful government of China, and by extension a part of China, it is at the same time actively refusing unification efforts with the mainland, even though they literally are Chinese, even though Taiwan was a province of China before it was taken over by the Kuomintang. They now believe themselves to have their own unique nationalist character, as in 2007 the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP for short, approved a resolution asserting itself as a separate entity from China. For all intents and purposes, China's claim to Taiwan is 100% legitimate under international law. They won the Civil War. The territory was already a part of China before the Kuomintang arrived and set up their government in exile, and with the collective of the Western world effectively dropping their recognition of the Republic of China as the real China, it's safe to say that there really isn't a solemn case to be made against the CPC's claim to the land, no matter how much the domestic Taiwanese population has been propagandized to think of themselves different or find independence the more tenable path forward. But of course, the West isn't about to let that happen due to the geopolitical significance of Taiwan. Let us finish by describing the real reasons why America is so interested in Taiwanese independence. Fun fact: nearly 50% of the world's shipping containers and seabound cargo will make its way through the Strait of Taiwan at some point. Another fun fact: China's Belt and Road, which shall run through Europe and into Africa and back into China, is planning on finishing its loop through the Strait of Taiwan. A third fun fact: the United States has hundreds of military bases, blockades, and formations surrounding the coast of China and the South China Sea. From Japan, to South Korea, to Hong Kong, to the Philippines, to Indonesia, and so on. America has been encroaching more and more into Chinese territory for some time, and being the holder of the world's reserve currency, the dollar, the United States is all too keenly aware of the Belt and Road and the kind of threat it poses to U.S. hegemony. After all, America's ability to dominate the world and exercise its influence is contingent on its ability to manipulate its reserve currency via the selective shunting of nations who have fallen out of line with United States interests. Some of these nations include the likes of Iran, Cuba, and North Korea, whom at this time are strangled by sanctions. However, for China to complete its Belt and Road would mean the constructing of alternative international trade infrastructure which would allow countries across Asia, Europe, and Africa to directly bypass United States hegemony and undercut the dollar via this new trade network. A fact that the U.S. State Department knows, which is why they've been working to solidify relations with their satellite Taiwan in hopes of being able to transform it into yet another strategic military hardpoint for the United States against China. It also gives America a strategic hardpoint with incredibly close proximity to the Chinese mainland, which in a World War III scenario will be invaluable for a preemptive deep strike into Chinese territory. Why else would America be pumping hundreds of millions of dollars of military hardware into the country? One thing is clear in the face of this. It is the United States who is the aggressor. If the situation were reversed and, say, China was building up naval blockades and sea bases off the west coast and sending military incursions into territories of the U.S., meeting with the leaders of Hawaii and Puerto Rico in regards to securing the independence of these regions, the collective of the imperialists would be clutching their pearls, screaming bloody murder, and threatening nuclear Armageddon over such a thing. But when America threatens the world, builds military bases across every corner of the planet, arbitrarily invades and bombs countries, and strangles its poor neighbors to death with sanctions, it's always somehow justifiable under the pretense of spreading freedoms. Oh wait, it's spreading gay rights and civil rights now, isn't it? The country which is in the process of taking away civil rights from its own citizens are now the ones invading and fucking with smaller and weaker countries due to their lack of civil rights. However, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the justification might be. The point stands that China aren't the ones constantly meddling in other countries' elections, overthrowing sovereign democratic governments, sanctioning and bombing countries left and right, and enabling far-right dictatorships everywhere. Western imperialist apologists can argue all that they want that if China had America's geopolitical influence, it would do the exact same thing, if not worse, even though, one, it is within China's power to do some of the same things that America does, but they're still not, and they're choosing an alternative path to soft power building and alliance building via the establishment of trade networks. And two, who gives a flying fuck whether or not China or Russia or anybody else would be worse if they had our power? It's a complete non-argument because we're dealing with the reality of the situation, which is that America is still objectively worse and is arguably the most bloody and reactionary empire in human history. Furthermore, as leftists, we should be striving for the ultimate abolition of imperialism everywhere. Since we just so happen to live within the borders of the worst offender, that is the United States, we as American leftists should be striving for the ultimate defeat of the U.S. empire. Leave the anti-China imperialism to the Chinese, and leave the anti-Russian imperialism to the Russians. Worry about your own nation's aggressive political policy, because that's the only one which is within your immediate proximity to influence. What we shouldn't be doing is identifying with our governments and making their imperialist policy out to be something that should be reformed for the better. None of it is good, and we should therefore be opposed to all of it. The problem with the Iraq War wasn't that it was carried out incompetently. The problem with the Iraq War is that we even did it in the first place. Well, it's better that it's us doing the imperialism, fascism, and genocide, because if it wasn't us, somebody else would be doing it, except worse. So it's best that it's us, because we're spreading freedom and civil rights. People who argue and belabor this case are only doing so as a coping mechanism so that they can willfully dismiss and ignore the reality of the situation so that they can continue to justify their support for the empire and continue to live in a fantasy land where America are the good guys, where America are the world police, and that it's our job as Western white Europeans to tell all the other countries how to live, how to organize and conduct themselves, how to use their resources, and so on. So really, we're doing them a favor. It's the classic white man's burden. Classic settler mindset. At the end of the day, it's always easier for people to stick their heads in the sand and support the status quo than it is for them to take a less popular and more difficult, yet infinitely more principled stance against the empire. In other words, they would rather stay sheep out of pure convenience. It's not that they don't understand, it's that they don't want to understand. Which is why they get so upset when you ruin their fantasy by reminding them of the facts about the true degree of violence, cruelty, barbarism, and objective evil of the United States Empire. When you get down to it, imperialist apologists can't handle the truth about the ugliness of their own position and the actions of their own government, so they drape a flag over it. They call it freedom, and hope that you're stupid enough to go along with it. But regardless of the Western chauvinism, the American exceptionalism, the imperialist apologia, and the white settler psychology of these people, at the end of the day, it is America that we should be first and foremost concerned with calling out and standing in direct opposition against, since this government is the number one threat to world peace, on top of being the number one obstacle to the construction of socialism everywhere, on top of the fact that we live here. We're inside the borders of this country. It is the closest thing that we can influence with respect to proximity, so that's what we should be trying to influence and change. Leave the anti-China imperialism to the Chinese and leave the anti-Russian imperialism to the Russians. At the end of the day, we should all be striving for the revolutionary defeat of our own governments, and anybody who sincerely cares about the liberation of humanity wouldn't be out here making excuses for said government and constantly trying to justify its actions abroad. They'd be calling it out and calling for its active death and destruction. If you enjoy this content, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe, and share with your neighbors on social media. And if you'd like to help me out in more substantial ways than that, consider becoming a Patreon for as little as $2 per month. Speaking of which, shout out to my contributors, the names of which are on screen. Your gratuity is greatly appreciated. If you'd like your name to be added to this list, once again, please consider donating for as little as $2 per month. That's all I have to say for now. Thanks for listening.